A River Between Us by Richard Peck. Read for you by Mrs. Shoemaker. The House Astride the Devil's Backbone, 1861. Chapter 2. "Tilly," Mama called out to me from the kitchen, "go find Cass." The sun was winking away behind the big rock across the river. Tower Rock, standing high out of the water. A grove of trees grew over the top of it. Tower Rock rose on the other bank of the river, and our Devil's Backbone here on the Illinois side. A dangerous stretch of river ran between. Our stretch of the river. Even though Tower Rock was over in Missouri, with the river between us, it gave our town its name, Grand Tower. Nobody wanted to live in a town named after the devil. It wasn't any use to holler for Cass from the porch. Up in her private place in her hill, she was deafened to the world. Cass was a terrible worry to Mama, and I thought anything that worried Mama ought to worry me. As quick as the sun was down, a chill came off the water. It was the end of April, with some spring showing. Time for the river to stir itself. Word had reached us that the ice was breaking up below St. Paul and rotting above Dubuque. We'd had the packet boats down from Quincy and St. Louis, but we needed the southern boats to keep us in business. And only days ago President Abe Lincoln had proclaimed a blockade on the southern ports. Last month, when Lincoln was inaugurated as President of the United States, we'd built bonfires down by the landing to celebrate. Show him the way to Washington, as people said. Few were for him, of course. You had to set a fire to the woods and sift the ashes to find a Republican around here. But Lincoln was an Illinois man, one of us. Now we didn't know what to think. The South was breaking away. And what did this blockade mean? If it meant shutting down the river traffic, it was serious. We heard Arkansas was ready to pull out of the Union, and St. Louis was in an uproar. We saw trouble coming our way. Cass had blazed the only paths there were to the crest of the hill. I made right for her. I always knew where to look for Cass. I just never knew what I'd find when I got there. She was slumped on a flat rock we always called the Devil's Footstool, just among ourselves. From here, you looked down through the trees to the landing and across the river, too. You could see forever from here, though what Cass saw didn't bear thinking about. She huddled in Mama's old threadbare shawl. Her face was wet with tears, gray as the sundown river. She was only 12 and looked 10. She'd just about give up on school. The winter took so much out of her. And thin. Not much more than breath and britches. The wind went straight through her, though we were both still sewed into our winter underwear. That's the way we done in them days. You was sewed into your underwear in October, and you didn't see yourself again until late spring. We thought if we got naked and washed ourselves in the wintertime, we'd catch a chill that would carry us off. "Oh, Cassie, for pity's sake," I said, big sister in her. I flung down on the Devil's Footstool, and she let me hug her close. She looked up like she'd never laid eyes on me. Her eyes were too big for her face. "Cassie, what now?" "Dreadful." She tucked her face into my shoulder. "All the dead and the dying. You can smell their wounds from here." "Who this time?" I asked, but I didn't want to know. "Is it the wedding party?" I hope not. The wedding party was Grand Tower's oldest story. It went back to 1839, and people talked about it yet. It seemed there was a young couple who took a notion to get married across the river on top of Tower Rock. She was Miss Penelope Pike, and he was John Randolph Davis, both of them shirt-tail kin to half the county. They set forth in an open boat with the bride's parents and sister, the groom's mother, and 3 slaves. The Reverend Josiah Maxwell went too, to tie the knot for them. Well, they got married on the rock. Don't ask how they got up to the top of the thing. That's never part of the story. On their way back, their boat was caught crossways in the current and pulled down by a whirlpool. They disappeared without a trace, though a moment before they were visible from both shores. That was the story of the wedding party. The problem was that Cass often saw them. From up here, where she nested, she caught sight of them pushing off in an old-timey boat. They'd be the bride wearing her veil crowned with orange blossoms. There'd be the groom behind her, splitting the seams on his best coat to help with the rowing. There they'd be in the bright morning of all their hopes. To hear her tell it, Cass saw them as clear as if she'd been one of the party. It could get a lot worse than that. Cass had seen the wedding party return. She saw them after the whirlpool had drowned them down to the bottom of the river. Now they were pulling hard for this shore in their swamped boat, pulling and pulling, and never making it. She saw them, caked in silt, their hands tangled with weed. She saw their gray corpse faces eaten away by the fish, the bridal veil snagged on the bride's skeleton shoulder. She saw their ghosts. No, Tilly. Cass pulled back from me. Not this time. Though it was in April, when they was drowned. Her face was solemn and smudgy. Evening was drawing in on us even here, at the top of the backbone. Was it the old Spaniards? I said. Or the Frenchies? Many a time she'd seen them, too. She said she had. She'd seen the first explorers on this river, though they'd come 200 years ago, maybe more. She could tell you everything about them, describe to you every chink in their queer foreign boats. She could smell the hogs the Spanish brought to feed themselves. She saw the Frenchmen coming down from the northern lakes in their pirogues. They were dressed in Chinese costumes, for they were looking for China and expected it around every bend in the river. She could call these ancients by name, though she hadn't learned them in school. She paid very little attention at school. These old explorers were never just drifting peacefully past, not in Cass's visions. She saw them caught in the quick of the drain of the whirlpool. She saw their sudden swirling deaths far from home. All hands lost before they could know. She heard the hogs squealing their last. Sometimes it was the Indians who died, though they were wiser to the river than foreigners. The eddies between our rocks would claim them too. Their swift, slender canoes folded like paper. Hands upflung, they were swept in a circle out of sight. They were the Miamis, Cass said, though how could she know? She sobbed in my arms until my shoulder was wet. She was worse this time. Was she getting worse? I looked away down to the landing. It reached out in the water, lanterns lit to lead the boats that hadn't come. Mama feared that people were commencing to talk about Cass. She never told her visions outside the family. She said little or nothing in company. But people could see her up here, perched on the devil's backbone. Before the trees greened, they could see her plain staring out at the river like a soul in torment. They called her Moony. Mama feared that one day they'd call her mad. Then what could be done about her? I'd have to get her home now, though she was blind with tears. Cass, tell me who you see now. Who do you mourn? Who are the dead and the dying this time? She liked to work free of me, pulling away from her own visions. You could tell they were a knife to her heart. All the boys, she keened. Just boys. Blown apart. Blue and gray. And when she said they were blue and gray, I thought she meant their cold, drowned faces. Maybe I thought that. Too young, she moaned. Boats burdened with them, and blood in the water behind. She'd seen steamboats blow up too, many times. But who hadn't? The big steamboats blew up often enough, 6 or 8 right near us that I could remember. The Ida May and the Little Jim Reese and the Bella St. Louis among 'em. The boilers would cut loose and rip the rickety contraptions to splinters and smithereens. Bodies boiled alive would wash ashore for days after. But we'd all seen that. When did it happen, Cass? She looked at me with eyes more haunted than her heart. It ain't happened yet, she said. I went cold to my core. All her visions looked back, sometimes to ages past. Now she'd whipped around and was looking ahead. And that was the April when we all feared the future. It was the spring of 1861, when all the news was bad, promisin' worse. She was limp as a rag. I gathered her up and dabbed at her eyes with the shawl. And as we drew nigh the house, Noah, our brother, was climbing the hill home for his supper. Noah had grown tall as a stork seemingly overnight. His knees were working through his breeches and his wrists grown out his sleeves. He stalked up through the trees with Pa's old fowling piece on his shoulder. The gun was older than the shoulder that bore it. The barrel was scabby with rust, but Noah had been marching and drilling with it. A bunch of local boys met up after their work, pretending to soldier. You couldn't get many boys to stick up for U.S. Grant and the North that April. Only the Henson boys, and Gideon Hickman, and Jack Popejoy, and Noah. You could hear them from up here barking out their raggedy commands. Draw saber. By the right flank, quick trot, march. Like they knew all about it. They'd march with whatever they had. A squirrel rifle, a corn knife, a paling off the porch. They looped lariats at their sides for leading home a Reb prisoner of war. Down the road by the old stone structure, they served as a schoolhouse. A bigger bunch of boys drilled, but they drilled for the South and Jeff Davis. Among them, the Cottrell brothers, and Mose Thornton, and Jarrett Dalrymple, and Curry Marshall. They divvied up, some for the North, more for the South. Why didn't they just fight it out right here in the road, fair and square? Did they even know it could end with them killing one another in some God-forsaken loblolly far from home? I couldn't get my mind around it, and I'd always thought I understood Noah. We were twins, and I swore I could hear his heartbeat. Coming along behind me, Cass caught sight of him. She let out a startled cry, and I thought she'd bolt. Instead, she burst into fresh tears and heaved with sobs. Both hands covered her face. I had to lead her home.